Dear students, welcome back to the e-learning course 4, Derivatives and Risk Management. In session 2.2, we will take a closer look how the margin account and marking to market works. Moreover, we will study how financial and commodity futures are priced. The learning goal of this session is to understand the mechanics of futures trading, in particular the margin account as well as the pricing of financial and commodity futures. One of the major differences beside contract standardization between forward and futures is the daily settling or marking to market of these contracts. This means the maturity date of the contract does not govern realization of profit or loss. Instead, as futures prices change, the proceeds accrue to the trader's margin account immediately. In general, we distinguish between the initial margin and the maintenance margin. The initial margin is set between 5% and 15% of the total value of the contract. The maintenance margin is a lower threshold for the margin account. If the value of the account falls below this value, the trader receives a margin call, requiring that the margin account be replenished or the position be reduced to a size appropriate with the remaining funds. Margins and margin calls safeguard the position of the clearinghouse. Note that positions are closed out before the margin account is exhausted. In order to get a more comprehensive understanding of margins, let us consider an example. Suppose an investor takes a long position in 2 December gold futures contracts on June 5. The future price is $400 per ounce and the contract size is 100 ounces. Based on these assumptions, it follows that the initial margin to be paid to the clearinghouse is $2,000 per contract and the maintenance margin is $1,500 per contract. Suppose now on June 5th the futures price drops to $397, which implies a loss of $300 per contract. Since the investor holds 2 futures contracts, the total loss on the trading day corresponds to $600. Since losses are settled daily, the clearinghouse deducts the $600 from the investor's margin account. On June 13th, another loss occurs and the balance in the margin account falls $340 below the maintenance margin level. This drop triggers a margin call from the broker for an additional $1,340. In this example, it is assumed that the investor does in fact provide this margin by the close of trading on June 16th. However, on June 19th, the balance in the margin account again falls below the maintenance margin level, and a margin call for $1,260 is sent out. Again, the investor provides this margin by the close of trading on June 20th. If you want to buy a security, you have basically 2 choices. The first and probably most natural choice is that you buy the security, for instance a stock, for immediate delivery at the current spot price. This means you're the legal owner of the stock and thus have a claim to dividend payments. The second option is related to buying an asset forward by placing an order for future delivery at the futures price. If you use a futures contract, you don't pay for the asset up front, which allows you to earn interest on the current purchase price. However, since you didn't buy the asset immediately, you're not the legal owner and thus miss out on any dividends that are paid in the meantime. Based on these arguments, the relationship between spot and futures prices is as follows. The futures price for a contract lasting T periods, denoted FT, equals today's spot price as 0 times 1 plus the risk-free rate minus the dividend yield to the power of T. The next example shows how and why this formula works. Suppose the 6 months CAC futures contracts trade at 5,000, when the current CAS index is 5,045.41. Assume that the interest rate is 1% per year, or approximately 0.5% over 6 months. And the annual dividend yield on the index is 2.8% on an annual basis, or about 1.4% over 6 months. Substituting these numbers into the formula, you recognize that these numbers fit the formula perfectly. The question is now, why are these numbers consistent? The answer to this question is based on a no arbitrage argument. Recall that an asset can be bought spot or forward, and both ways need to lead to the same result. If you buy the CAC index today for 5,045.41, it follows that in 6 months you own the index and also have dividends of 70.64. However, if you decide to buy a futures contract for 5,000 instead, and you put 5,045.41 in the bank, after 6 months the bank account has earned interest at 0.5%, so your account balance is 5,070.64. As you immediately recognize, this is enough to buy the index for 5,000 with 70.64 left over. The remainder exactly covers you for the dividend payment you've missed by buying the asset forward rather than spot. So far, we have studied how to price financial futures. The next topic to address is how to price futures and commodities. The difference between buying commodities today and buying commodities futures is a bit more complicated, but not too hard to understand. In order to do so, we proceed in 3 steps. As before, when we buy an asset using a futures contract, the payment is delayed and the buyer of the futures earns interest on the money which otherwise would have been used for buying the asset immediately at the current spot price. In general, if you buy commodities on the spot market, you need facilities like a warehouse to simply store what you have bought. If you buy forward, you save these storage costs. A third feature of buying commodities using futures is that these contracts give you no convenience yield, which is just a fancy description of the fact that if you buy a commodity spot, you will be able to use the commodity right away. For instance, if you buy heating oil spot, you can use it to heat up your house if there is a sudden cold snap. But heating oil futures won't help you in such a scenario, since the delivery of the commodity will be in the future. Based on these characteristics of commodity futures contracts, we can come up with a formula for pricing these contracts. For that purpose, let's express storage costs and convenience yield as fractions of the spot price. For commodities, the futures price for T periods ahead is the following formula. It is interesting to compare this formula with the formula for financial futures. As you probably recognize, convenience yield plays the same role as dividends foregone on securities. But since financial assets cost nothing to store, storage costs do not appear in the formula for financial futures. Since storage cost and convenience yield can't be observed, we infer the difference between them by comparing spot and futures prices. The difference that is simply convenience yield less storage cost is called net convenience yield. This definition allows us to rewrite the pricing formula as follows. Let us take a look at the following example to better understand how to compute net convenience yield. Suppose that in February the spot price of crude oil was $48.97 a barrel, and the 6-month futures price is $56.65 per barrel. The interest rate was about 0.035% for 6 months. Substituting these numbers into the pricing formula allows us to solve for net convenience yield. Based on the given numbers, a net convenience yield of minus 15.6% results. This implies that the cost of holding crude oil inventories was greater than the convenience yield provided by those inventories. From an economic perspective, a negative convenience yield is an indication that oil is in ample supply and users have no worries they would run short of oil in the month ahead. The following figure plots the annualized net convenience yield for crude oil since the early 1980s. By looking at the graph, you recognize that the spread between the spot and futures price, which is by definition net convenience yield, varies around quite a bit. When there are shortages or fears of an interruption of supply, traders may be prepared to pay a larger premium for the convenience of having inventories of crude oil rather than the promise of future delivery. Of course, the opposite is true when storage tanks are full to the brim, as in early 2015. After having carefully studied session 2.2, please start with the review questions.